Yeah. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Welcome to Are We There Yet? My experience leading a Kubernetes release team. Excited that all of y'all could join me on this wonderful Wednesday evening right before the party that we have tonight. So first off, who am I? As Stephen just wonderfully introduced me, I am a technical program manager at Pivotal Software. I'm based out of our New York office. I am a former Kubernetes enhancements lead, release team lead, and the current release team emeritus advisor for 117. And I also just love coffee and travel as a note. Feel free to come up and talk with me at any point during the conference or after on Slack about any of these topics. So before we get started, I just want to note that I'm only going to be speaking about my personal experience as a release team member. So as such, you can expect this talk to be very focused on the enhancements and release lead aspects of my experience, since those were the two roles I was a lead for. I cannot easily speak to the experience of CI signal or docs. I might touch upon them briefly, but will not be going into details. Additionally, this whole experience is my own. There are tons of release team members who can add their own color and their own flavor to the release team. I highly encourage everyone to join the channel if you want to learn more, and it's #SIGRelease in the Kubernetes Slack. So, what is the K8s Release Team? Who in this room is familiar with the Kubernetes Release Team? A couple folks, awesome. For those of you who aren't aware, I'm gonna go into a little bit of detail about what the Kubernetes Release Team is. So, the Kubernetes Release Team is a sub-project of SIG-Release. SIG stands for Special Interest Group. It is responsible for shipping the Kubernetes release approximately once a quarter. That's the cadence we've been going on for the past few releases. This is the release team. They're charged with making sure that we're able to ship a quality release to all of our end users, again, on a regular cadence. The release team is mostly staffed by volunteers. Some folks might get company-sponsored time to work on it, but a lot of people do this in their own free time. And the time requirement needed can be anywhere from maybe an hour a week to a couple hours a week, and it usually ramps up as the release goes on. So these are a lot of really kind, amazing people who volunteer their time for 1 quarter, maybe 2, depending on how far you want to go, could be more. Additionally, we're a fully distributed team. We have folks in almost every single continent that is inhabited. I'm sure if somebody wanted to set up an outpost in Antarctica, we'd accept them as well. Like, it is all over the world. And as such, we have to do everything to accommodate people across all different time geos and do everything fully remote, leveraging tools like Slack, GitHub, Zoom, and posting all of our release meetings onto the Kubernetes YouTube channel. And additionally, the release team has a shadow program that is there to help mentor new release team members. So those folks can join and learn more about the release team processes, and then one day take over as lead, or maybe they shadow for a release and realize, oh, I'm actually really interested in this other part of the Kubernetes org. I'm gonna move over there, and that's all totally cool. On the right-hand side of this slide, I have a list of every single member of the current 117 release. As you see, it's a lot of individuals, and it's a wonderful team made up of brilliantly talented people. So, now getting into a little bit more of some personal stories of my experience on the release team. So, my journey started in 112. Some coworkers were looking into the release team and were shadowing on the release team at that time. They had reached out because they wanted to get more folks involved, and they talked about how interesting it was. In my day job, I work helping to shepherd our proprietary products releases, and as a release manager doing that, I was really interested to see what are the differences between the open source community versus what we do in our company. Are there any cool practices we can learn from the open source that we can bring into our company to better improve our systems and processes? So I started joining some of those release team meetings very covertly, mostly quietly, just sitting on a Zoom call and not saying a single word, but just listening. And then around September 2018, they asked for volunteers to shadow different roles for the 113 release. And I volunteered to be an enhancements shadow. I thought enhancement sounded really interesting. I wanted to better understand how different enhancements and features landed in a Kubernetes release and what that process was. So volunteered and was accepted as a shadow for that release. In 1.14, I stepped up to be an enhancements lead, and that was around December 2018. And I led the enhancements for that release for an entire quarter. Now, a little bit unconventional, in 1.15 I stepped up to be a release lead. It's unconventional because typically you have to shadow as a release lead before you can step up to lead the release. At the time in March, the 2 shadows for release lead could not dedicate the time to be release lead in the following quarter, and they could not find other former release lead shadows who had the time to dedicate. So they asked me if I would be interested, and I accepted with a little bit of hesitation because I was a little bit nervous to see what it would be about without shadowing it, but it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had in the open source community to date. And then after that release, I took a bit of a break, and then in 1.17 rejoined as the release team as the emeritus advisor. The emeritus advisor role is tasked with helping to ensure the shadows of the release have a positive experience, that they're able to get mentorship, and that folks who want to continue in the release team know the right paths to continue. So I also want to mention that being on the release team was my first introduction to the Kubernetes community. And I thought that it was a really great way to join this community. It's a well-defined sub-project with great mentorship opportunities. There's a very clear path for growth, and as a shadow, you're able to actually have a hands-on experience and impact the release. Additionally, the release team touches so many different SIGs and working groups. As an enhancements shadow, one of the first tasks I had was going through every single issue in Kubernetes enhancements, which is where new enhancements are proposed to land in a Kubernetes release, and pinging issue owners to see if they were interested in landing that issue in the next release. And that was one way to just meet a ton of different people in the community and learn a lot about all the different enhancements folks were trying to land in the release. And additionally, almost every other role on the release team, you get to work across a variety of different SIGs. And so even if afterwards you find out that the release isn't something you're interested in, you've had so much exposure to the Kubernetes project that it's really easy to find other areas you're interested in contributing to beyond it. So, what did I find interesting about the Kubernetes release team? As I mentioned, I joined because I was really interested to see what that release process is about for an open source project. So after working with the release team for over a year, what did I think was interesting? One thing that's really fascinating to me is it's a constantly rotating release team. I have up the 1.13 release team members and the 1.17 release members. There are only 3 names that are appearing on both release teams, and that's over the course of about 4 releases. Through the Shadow program, we're able to mentor and train people to take on these roles, so no one needs to volunteer in perpetuity to ensure that the Kubernetes release is able to ship. And you can volunteer for as much time as you relatively need to, be it a quarter, maybe 2. You can really choose, based on your own life circumstances, what works best for you. And even rotating these release team members, we're still able to ship a fairly high-quality release to the community. Decision-making. So decision-making in an open source community is very interesting. For me personally, as release lead, I had a lot of autonomy to make decisions, which was interesting as a relatively new member in the community with less than a year experience. One particular example, for 1.15, I had full autonomy mostly to set the release schedule. For 1.15, we had to deal with KubeCon Barcelona, Memorial Day weekend in the US, KubeCon Shanghai, and then wanting to ship before 4th of July. So that's 4 major events for the community within a quarter. And having to balance through all of that and figure out the best decision to make was definitely difficult. Not everybody was happy with the release schedule decision, and we have a retro where everyone is allowed to voice their very strong opinions and feelings, but being given the autonomy to do what worked best from my perspective and taking into account all of the different aspects going on in the community was very, very interesting to me. Again, with such little experience, but after making the decision, everyone in the community was very supportive and adhered to it and didn't try to change things after the fact. Additionally, since it's an open source community, decision-making has to be fully transparent. All of our Zoom meetings, as I mentioned, get published to YouTube. All of our notes are in public-facing Google Docs that anyone can go and read. All of our decisions are discussed in open Slack channels. It's just very interesting to see decision-making happening in such a transparent way when it's not always in other communities or even within companies done that way. And lastly, the thing about decision-making that's super interesting is you very much see this push towards community versus individual needs. Some examples during the release cycle as we were approaching code freeze. Once code freeze hits, if an enhancement isn't fully finished code-wise, it gets bumped out. We had quite a few enhancements that coming up were at risk, had a few still open PRs, and every single member on those SIGs, even members who were writing that code, were able to make their own decisions that they wanted to bump those release or those enhancements out to the next release versus wanting to push that decision onto me or my enhancements lead to make that, which just shows that people prioritize the needs of the community and making sure these releases have enhancements that are solid, quality, have had time to test, versus pushing their own individual needs out because they've been working on this feature for a long time. Additionally interesting, few things block a Kubernetes release. And I don't know if this is because we have such an excellent team of people who are really good at risk management, and they're constantly on top of checking everything from CI signal tests, making sure docs are in place, release notes are ready. But additionally, as I just mentioned, things are often getting descoped and bumped because, again, folks want to ensure that we have a quality release that is able to ship on time. People are willing to descope and move issues out until the next release to make sure we're able to ship once a quarter. Just as a note, 1.15 was delayed by 2 days, and the thing that blocked it was scalability tests. And we wanted to make sure that we understood why those scalability tests were failing. So even though it would have been great for me to have been able to ship that on Monday, because I had a team offsite that whole week, I decided that it was better to slightly inconvenience myself and miss parts of my team offsite to make sure that the release was able to ship, knowing what the scalability test failures were. Another thing I find really interesting, the release team is constantly iterating. They're open to new changes, and when folks come in and see something that could be improved upon, we go with it. So an example, the shadow program, as I've mentioned. When I joined in 1.13, becoming a shadow, all you had to do was comment on a GitHub issue saying you were interested, and then someone would slot you right into place, you'd be on the release team. And that worked. We had plenty of shadows, but not every single role was fully filled in terms of the amount of shadows they could take on, and not every single shadow fully understood what they were signing up for necessarily. So starting in 1.14, we introduced a survey, and this survey had lots more information, links to all of the different documentations about release roles that are in GitHub, and it allowed the release team to better understand the folks who are volunteering to join. It's a very short survey, asks a few questions about their interest, amount of time, and we also noticed after interviewing the survey, or introducing the survey, we had a huge spike in interest, and that spike in interest has continued over the next few iterations. In this 1.15 one, it's very small, but there were 49 responses of interest to being a shadow for that release. And in 1.17, we had over 70 folks sign up with interest. And we'll have one come out again for 1.18. If you're interested in being a shadow, definitely join the SIG Release Slack channel. We will likely be posting it there once it goes live. Next up for iterations, as roles need to be updated and revised, we do that as a group. So some examples, from 1.12 to 1.13, the features lead became the enhancements lead. The role stayed mostly identical. It was a simple change in name, and that was because the word enhancements was more inclusive of the types of issues being opened. From 1.14 to 1.15, we added the emeritus advisor as we were starting to get more shadows interested, we noticed a need to have a role introduced specifically for mentoring and making sure that shadows were getting the most out of the release that they possibly could. So we added an additional role to help with that. From 1.15 to 1.16, the test info role was dissolved, mostly due to the amazing work of many different test info role leads past and Catherine Berry, who were able to automate the role out of existence. And anything that didn't need to be automated, they were able to roll over to the branch management team, showing that we're constantly able to iterate and improve upon our processes and automate things that can be automated. Introducing KEPS. This was an interesting one for me. So KEPS became mandatory for enhancements freeze starting in 1.14. KEPS stands for Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal. For any enhancement that wants to land in a release, they need to have a KEP in a merged and implementable state by the enhancement freeze deadline. And we introduced this requirement in 1.14. And what we learned is that rolling out new policies for a massive org isn't always smooth, but sometimes you do really just need to rip the Band-Aid off and do it. When we introduced this policy that KEPS were mandatory, a lot of enhancements did not have their KEPS ready and in an implementable state on enhancements freeze. And we had to be a little bit flexible with them because, again, we didn't want to ship a release that had no enhancements because folks didn't have enough time to get their enhancements ready. But starting 1.15, we had fewer and fewer that needed to submit exception requests at that enhancements freeze. So it was a little bit painful in 1.14, but now looking towards 1.17, everyone knows they need a KEP for enhancements freeze. And it's a much smoother process. And as a result, the release has much more information about the enhancements landing because we have these KEPs documented up front. So, some takeaways from this talk that I hope you all can leave with. The Kubernetes values for the org are published on this GitHub repo link down here. And you see these values ever present in the release team. Distribution, better than centralization. As I mentioned, our release team is fully distributed across multiple continents. And to do that, we have to make sure that we're allowing for all of our work and communication to happen in distributed places like Slack, GitHub, Zoom, and Google Docs that everyone can access. And folks aren't sitting in one office in a room in a single company. It's distributed across many different companies. And even folks who aren't even in companies or in college or are just working independently. Community over product or company. As I mentioned, folks really put the community first when it comes to the release over any of the needs of a product that they're really passionate about or the company that they work for. You see this as they are willing to push enhancements out to later releases, making sacrifices when needed in terms of maybe working late to help folks out in the community. You see this a lot, and it's really, really exciting to see. Automation over process. As I mentioned, automating the test info role out of existence is a big part of that, but additionally within the release team, there are plenty of places where folks are looking to automate and make it more efficient. Inclusive is better than exclusive. I found the release team to be one of the most inclusive places. You can just join the calls. You don't even feel awkward about it. Everyone is super friendly and welcoming. And when you volunteer to be a shadow and you join your first release team call, everyone is super welcoming and excited to have you. And you just feel automatically like you're in a giant SIG release hug. And I haven't worked with tons of different open source communities, but this one has felt to me the most at home from the beginning when I joined. And then evolution is better than stagnation. Again, the team is constantly evolving, constantly looking for ways to improve. And if you want to learn more, all of the documentation is available on GitHub in the SIG release repo. We have a Slack channel. Highly encourage everyone to join. If you're interested in joining the K8s Release Team for 1.18, again, keep an eye on Slack for a survey link, because we would love to have all of you volunteer to be shadows. And yeah, I'll give some time for questions.
So if you have questions, please wait until we get you on mic. I run over.
Can you talk a little bit about who does the QA work and how is their setup look like?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Who does the QA work before you release? And how's their testing infrastructure look like?
Yeah, so we have, for QA work, every single SIG is responsible for setting their own testing up, and we have Kubernetes test grid, and in addition to that, there's SIG testing. On the release team specifically, we have the CI signal team. So they have a lead and shadows, and they are responsible for monitoring the tests and working with SIGs to resolve any issues or any flakes or failures on the tests.
Hold on.
So is there a standard way for them to set up their testing infrastructure, or just the freeform, like 8 nodes cluster?
I do not know the answer to that. That might be a good question for SIG testing, or Stephen might know.
So the way we do testing is Kubernetes uses Prow, which is a homegrown CI/CD solution. We have essentially templates that you can read. It's all YAML-based format, which is very close to what a Kubernetes manifest looks like anyway, and we have annotations that you can layer on top of those job runs, so things like making sure your test is flagged in a certain dashboard, making sure that certain people are alerted, making sure that the alerts only happen after a certain amount of test failures. So we use Kubernetes to test Kubernetes and all that good stuff. It's turtles all the way down, right? All right.
So you mentioned there's now an enhancements freeze. How much lead time is that before the real freeze? And what does exactly implementable mean? Like, how complete is that?
Yes, so enhancements freeze, again, schedule setting is usually up to each lead, but it is about a month after the release cycle starts approximately. And since releases usually span about 3 months, you have about another month between enhancements freeze and code freeze approximately, and then another month after that until the release is shipped. And implementable for a KEP means that the SIG leads and reviewers have approved it, and you have the KEP fully filled out and fully baked with all the information in it about the plan to implement it, the different types of code that's needed, the different tests, all of that. And you can read more about KEPS. They are in the Kubernetes enhancements repo in GitHub.
You mentioned about time commitments. Is there different levels of time commitments between the different sub-projects within the release team?
So I don't know specifically about the different sub-projects in SIG release itself, but for the different roles on the release team, being a shadow is usually the least amount of time commitment compared to the lead role, and it does depend based on the lead, and different roles have different time needs at different points in the release. So enhancements, usually you have the time commitment up front because once code freeze hits, there's not a lot for enhancements to do, versus comms usually is very heavy towards the end because that's when you're setting up press releases and blogs. I would say across all of the different roles, it's hard to generalize a time commitment. Usually at a minimum, it's a 1-hour meeting a week for the release team. Some roles you might need to do closer to 4 to 5 hours a week. In the documentation we have on GitHub, I think a majority of them try to outline what goes on week by week. And you can also, again, always hop into Slack, ask the current release team folks in Slack, or any way you can reach them about what that looks like if you're interested in applying.
Yeah, so all of the role handbooks, we actually made it a requirement between Claire, Josh, and myself. All of the release handbooks have time dedication for each of the roles. So you can read up within the SIG release repo.
And you mentioned about cadence for the release. Say in a certain release, you try to add a feature, and then during the test phase, you find that there's an issue, there's a problem with this new feature. Do you pound out that in the release, or do you extend the release cadence?
So generally, we will punt the enhancement itself to the next release if there are any issues with it, and we try to ship the release on time. The idea being that if you miss 117, 118 is going to come a quarter later. You don't really need to wait that long because we'd rather have features that are fully tested, fully ready to land. And additionally, as enhancements are landing, they go through a process. So you don't usually just submit an enhancement and it goes straight to stable. That is very rare. More typically, it goes alpha, beta, then stable, with a couple of few exceptions here and there. Cool. If there's nothing else, feel free to come up and talk to me or find me on Slack. And everyone, enjoy the party tonight if you're going.